Suggest our voices.
Yeah. You project your voices.
Project the voices.
Yes.
In shout. Oh.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Professor Tandika Makandavire, thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. Let me first begin to recognize that the work which had culminated in 2012 with the acceptance of the idea of a social protection floor built very much on the work which you led when you were director of the United Nations Research Institute on Social Development in looking at social policy initiatives in different parts of the world and the possibilities and potential and in fact the necessity of bringing social policy back into the discussion. Would you share with us your summary of the major lessons, especially from the major study which you initiated?
Well, there were a couple of things. One was that social policy must address at least four things, which is distribution. Well, first of all, reproduction, because society must reproduce itself, and it's family politics and all that. Distribution, protection, and production. Okay, these were the four elements. And we insisted that there were synergies among these four, and that's what constitutes sort of a welfare regime, if you like. There's a danger of, of various people picking up separate parts and separating them. So people discuss distribution, other people talk protection. So that was one major story, that these are to identify these four factors and that actually work together, and that social policy is not simply a statement of ends of intrinsic value, but it's also instrumental value. For instance, in terms of production, some of the largest savings come from social policy, pension funds, and in human capital comes from social policy. So it has a very productive function. The second problem was that you don't have to wait until you're developed to have social policy. There is this linear view that the welfare state is a final stage of development. But the actual experience that if you're a latecomer, and in Europe it was the latecomers in Europe who introduced welfare state first, first for the Bismarck, and then because it turns out that if you're a latecomer and you're moving very fast, there are so many tensions in the process that require some social policy. And also there are also needs of production, of mobilizing labor that require social policy. So it's not something you do after you've developed. The third lesson was that it's pretty much, it's path dependent, that each country has to figure out how it makes its combinations. They're not really, you can talk about the Nordic model, but even there are very different models within Nordic countries. And finally, there was that it should not be treated as a residual. In fact, we were reacting to kind of the residualization of social policy during the structural adjustment period. Those, I think, will be the lessons I ought to consider important from the work.
There has been in recent years a great deal of focus and attention, particularly on cash transfer programs in Latin America,
yes,
Brazil and Mexico. But the volumes, the research which you led, actually showed a very rich array of experiences with social policy in different parts of the world, including in Asia, in fact, a great variety within Asia itself.
Yes.
And also in Africa. What do you think may be lost by this current focus narrowly on cash transfers?
One is, the point you're making is very important, that we have to, in the kind of Eurocentric view of social policy, certain issues were considered as social policy, protection, pension schemes and all, and a large range of what someone has called surrogate social policy measures were not considered as social policy. Like land reform, for instance, it doesn't appear in the literature on social policy. And for Asia, for some Asian countries, it was very important. And in Africa, the marketing boards in many countries had a social policy function, with pan-territory pricing and subsidizing the poor areas and so forth. So there were many things that were what might call social policy by other means that didn't count. And in this discovery of these cash transfers, all the other experiments are lost out, and the Ojama experiment, trying to have new villages and all that, those with all the problems they had. But there were many other experiments of social policy that have been lost out. the cash transfer process problem is there was a political reason why it started in Latin America. One, you have new democracies which are working on a very very strict fiscal regime. So you have political to react and do something, but with a very constrained budget. And what you do, you find a very cheap option, which was cash transfer. What is interesting in Latin America is that actually democracies, as you'd expect from democracies, they're moving away from that because they're now trying to incorporate this actually marginal social policy into the national social policy. And the attempts to transfer to Africa, there have been a lot of attempts and a lot of they call them pilot projects in Africa. Interesting enough, governments are not very keen on them, because it's one thing to have a pilot project in a country. A government cannot have a pilot project. And many of the researchers I've talked to who have been studying these pilot projects complain how the governments contaminate the experiments because, the government has to provide that to everybody. They can't say to one village, you wait for 10 years until we find out the results from this pilot project. But again, the cash transfer story was a Latin American story, and it's got a Latin American logic. And that logic, in Africa, you don't need special incentives for kids to go to school. All you need is proximity to the school, and that the school is there. So while in Latin America they argue that was an important incentive, it must have something to do. In some places, I would say in Brazil, a ratio factor that people had to be given an extra inducement to go to school, which may not have, in the case of Africa. But it's a Latin American experiment, and they have got their own debate about it, and they are changing it. It's just that the donors have repackaged it into a one-size-fits-all model that they are now forcing up, trying to persuade Africans to go to.
Since the financial crisis or the so-called Great Recession began in 2008, 2009, and we have seen a turn towards much more conservatism in discussions in the West.
Yes.
Now there is a mantra that the European welfare states have become quite unaffordable, and developing countries should avoid the pitfalls of the European welfare state and not go down that road. And this has been a major argument against social policy generally and social protection in particular. How would you respond to this kind of argument? What is when there is seemingly no constituency for a Polanyian second movement?
Yes. Well, if they want to condemn the rest of the world to conflict, yes. I mean, the Polanyian solution is not simply a wishful thinking, it's a reflection of a conflictual situation. And if many countries in Africa, the rapid urbanization that's taking place with no jobs, the growing inequality, which is recognized by everybody, will need a response. Okay? And that response can be Polanyian, and the Polanyian response can go either way. It can be democratic, it can be fascist, to solve the problem. So I think there's no way. And I think the concerns within the developed countries themselves with growing inequality shows the same concern to that. Even their own model needs re-embedding once again in the social. Affordability, the welfare states, most of the measures of the seeds of the welfare state were planted in Europe at lower levels of per capita income than countries in Africa have today. So it cannot be an argument of affordability. And there's a contradictory debate within even within the post-Washington consensus body. On one hand, a recognition that social policy has got developmental implications in terms of human capital and so forth, and therefore you have to invest in it. And on the other hand, saying you can't afford it. So if you can't afford something which is going to produce your human capital, then there's something wrong with your prospects of development are zero.
Yes. Let me turn to the question of development, which you have also been engaging with for many decades.
Yeah.
What do you think what do you think about the change of debates which have taken place over the decades? Some people would suggest that as economic growth took off about a decade ago in Africa after a quarter of a century of stagnation. There has been a renewed sense of confidence in certain quarters, and there's a greater openness to considering rethinking the development paradigm. So it's not just a failure on the part of the whole structural adjustment and liberalization model, but also this renewed confidence in Africa, which has been important. On the other hand, the outgoing chief economist for the African region at the World Bank continues to assert, without apparent contradiction, that the reason Africa has been doing well over the last decade is because of the success of the structural adjustment programs. What do you think is going on in terms at the level of thinking about economic development in Africa?
Well, I think the remarks by the former chief economist on Africa, this is a case where the triumph of faith over reason. You know, I mean, his argument is that yes, the structural adjustment didn't work when we were implementing it from Washington, but now that Africans are implementing it, it's working. In his argument with Carlos Lopez, that was his second position. He says, I didn't say the old one is now working, but I'm simply saying the African structural adjustment is working. And well, if he wants to maintain a paradigm, that's his right. My fear about the African debate is that, and I'm sort of trying to urge fellow Africans that, in the West, there's been a movement from Afro-pessimism to kind of an Afro-euphoria. Okay? And yet, if you look at the debates, it was before the recovery of Africa, there was a whole literature coming out, some from the World Bank, about mea culpas. What have we done wrong in Africa? And this was about lack of investment in education, in higher education, lack of investment in infrastructure, wrong sequencing of financial reforms, the whole sequence of mea culpas. When the economies began to recover, those mea culpas were forgotten. Okay? And now we're all happy, and when you mention the past, don't forget, you're wasting too much time on the past, let's look to the future. But if you look at some of the problems the current recovery is facing, most of them have to do with the earlier problem, that the accretion of mistakes created what I've called maladjusted economies. The African economies are having problems transforming their new acquired wealth from minerals into industrial production, for instance. And because they have they don't have financial institutions for long-term funding, human capital problem, huge energy shortages because there's been no new dam built in Africa since the 60s. Most of the dams in Africa from then. So we have to realize that there was maladjustment and begin and consciously correct those errors. If we simply think that this is a good time, let's proceed, and it will hurt us. But more importantly, that when we look at the factors behind the recovery, I can think of 4 factors. One, there's been an improvement in accountability and governance. Governments in Africa now are much more concerned with GDP growth rates than they were in the 60s and 70s. Secondly, there's been the obvious terms of trade effect, which is one of the longest terms of trade improvement for Africa. The third has been the investment in IT. There's been huge investment in IT, and the fourth, of course, is the minerals. Now, these 3 factors have nothing to do with macroeconomic policies. In fact, one of the most successful internet performances was Somalia, where there was no state at all. With the new technology, can function under very strange conditions. And the mining companies, all they want is the incentives for the sector, not for the macro. So we have these 3 factors. Some of them, all the 3 of them are transient. They're not really driven internally. Most economies in Africa, including the fastest growing ones, are still low savings economies. So we have not been able yet to generate factors that you can see are long-term factors. And we have had the high growth before. We had a boom rate, mineral booms led growth in the 60s. So one has to be very careful about that. And I think the Africans should, at least when talking to Africans, one insist that too much of our growth now depends too much on exogenous factors. There are very few that we really, except for good behavior and good governance, there are very few that we're really in control of.
If I can switch to agrarian situations and changing agrarian situations, over a decade ago you observed that why certain insurrections in Africa failed.
Yes, sir.
And in terms of the social base and pointed out, but the social base of course has a lot to do with the relationship between populations and the land.
Yes, yes.
And now, a decade later, um, what do you think has changed in terms of the situation? There continues, as you know, to be still a great deal of land seemingly available.
Yes, sir.
At the same time, you continue to see tremendous rural-urban migration.
Yes.
And how would you analyze the current situation in terms of the relationship, the demographic relationship to land resources?
Well, first, the most disturbing part of the story is that, if you recall, in structural adjustment had only one instrument for agriculture, which was remove price distortions. Many of us argued that that was not enough. You need infrastructure, you need but anyway, that was done. And one symbol of Africa's maladjustment is that the improvement in prices is not generating much production by peasants. And the responsiveness by peasants to this price incentives is much lower than you'd expect, but because of these structural constraints. So there's a danger that people are saying this is evidence that smallholder agriculture cannot work. Okay, when what in fact is the fact was that it was structural adjustment didn't work, and governments I think are buying into the idea that so we tried with smallholder education, agriculture, it didn't work, so now we must move to large-scale farming. And people like Paul Collier have been writing, arguing about let's move, and of course land grabbing the story, which I think in Africa is politically very explosive. Land problem in Africa, you have had communal ownership, and people have said it's a constraint on production, and therefore you must privatize it. And what has saved Africa from peasant movement, peasant revolts, I think we've had very few. It was I think Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, it's because of the access to land. And if that were to be removed, we would have the revolts that we haven't had. And in Africa, they would take it easily an ethnic dimension, if the land is very close to community. And that, for African countries, will be destabilized. So I think we have to rethink the kinds of support that smallholder agriculture requires, and one is not being romantic about smallholder production. I'm simply that the politics of Africa, if you don't have that and you have large-scale farming, you will probably have more problems of ethnic, even worse problems of ethnic conflict. The current debate by most governments in Africa is, well, African governments are quite strange. The strange thing are the more socialistic ones in the past are the ones more inclined to allow land grabbing, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zambia. Less so in Kenya, which are the more capitalistic, or Malawi, which are more capitalistic, partly because the local capitalists won't allow it. They won't allow foreigners to come and get the land. But in the more socialistic one, the state took over land in many countries. The state claimed it owned the land, and therefore it can dispose of the land. And that's the paradox of what's going on now. I don't believe myself that this land grabbing process will be productive. There was a lot of talk in the 70s about agribusiness. It didn't work, and for the simple reason that the kinds of inputs required by the private sector to be productive are not there. The white farmers from Rhodesia, when they were in Mozambique and they went to Congo and they came to Nigeria, and they were not successful because where they went, they didn't find the infrastructure they had from when they went to Zimbabwe. And so even for the new large-scale farming, you need a strong state to provide the required inputs. The African states right now do not have that kind of resources and capacity to provide a grand transformation, whether it's large-scale or small-scale. So Africa may find itself actually continue importing more food, and as we said, with the explosion of urbanization, that could actually block industrialization because we're not producing the wage good. In Asia, you had rice, which was wage good. In this case, if we're not able to produce the wage good for the urban areas, this urbanization and the youth bulge in the urban areas won't be translated into productive labor. That's my view about it.
Although we've run over time, let me ask one other question, and this is on the history of development, economic development ideas, which you have also contributed a great deal to. In Africa, as you know, there was a time when agriculture economics was the vogue.
Yes, yes.
At the same time, we have seen the deindustrialization of Africa,
Yes.
and also the undermining of African agriculture.
Exactly. Yes. Yes, yes.
Can you please comment on the ideas and how this came about? Because this is a phenomenon which has not really taken place in other parts of the world.
No, no, no. Well, the first round, it's often said that Africans ignored agriculture at the beginning, and that they went to industrialization. But actually, it's a little bit misleading, because many of the African governments, including the most radical like Nkrumah, doubled the output of cocoa. They thought they would use agriculture for industrialization. That was the assumption. And it was not that they neglected it; it's just that they wanted. And I think where they failed is in extracting surpluses. They did not transfer enough to keep on, going. But it was not as if they were saying, we don't want agriculture and we're going for industry. All you can say that they didn't manage to find a policy of increasing surplus production and increasing extraction for agriculture. Then came the experiments of McNamara, with the so-called integrated rural schemes, which were very large, costly schemes. And two characteristics. One, they were not replicable. Even if they succeeded, they were not replicable. It turned out they didn't succeed anyway, but they were not. And immediately after those experiments were started, came structural adjustment. And structural adjustment, although it appears to have been a critique of African government, it was actually an internal World Bank debate, a critique of the McNamara type of large-scale state interventionism. And it was presented as if it was simply an attack on the African government. And so that kind of a large-scale intervention ended from the World Bank and the African government themselves, and largely we were left with the market-driven phenomena, which reduced the whole agrarian question in Africa to pricing. We now, in the so-called post-Washington consensus, the argument there has been, there are two kinds of arguments. One has been that what's wrong with agriculture today is lack of institutions. And you ask what institution, they were saying property rights, and the usual story about institutions. None of those institutions that they're calling for were important in the Green Revolution of Asia, or they're just institutions in a very the new institutional debate. And that's as much as we are where we are now on agriculture. There are no institutions that deliberately will transfer credit facilities for rural sector. Very few institutions that are designed to provide fertilizers and all that. The idea has been these institutions that are supposed to be to allow the market to perform. And I think from the World Bank point of view now, we are seeing a little bit, they're now beginning to say maybe infrastructure was important after all, and that this cannot be done by the private sector. We are in I have somewhere argue that historically, when people think of agricultural change, you always have an overriding question. In Asia, there was a big problem of land shortage and and revolutions that were going on. So there was that defined the agrarian question. In Latin America, it was how do you transform these large scales to productive. In Africa, we have not had that. It's been food crisis at one time, then it became urbanization, poverty problem. Now I think it's called environmental problem. So we've been shifting almost every 5 years. So we've never had a focusing view of what is the agrarian question in Africa. And that's where we are now. Now it's in worse, in a complete state of from sustainable agriculture to large-scale farming and to feed the urban areas. Or we can't actually make up. We don't have a guiding principle which will focus your research on your and your policies.
Thank you very much, Professor Makandavire.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you.
Keep us.
Thank you.
Keep us honest.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Are you happy with the interviews?
You'll have